Once more, ladies and gentlemen, this is 1812 with Josh and Jimmy, and today, at long last, the episode where Jimmy tells us about visiting Napoleonic Wars sites in Russia, and what you can see of the Napoleonic Wars when visiting Russia. How many times have you been to Russia?
So I've been to Russia, I may have lost count, but I think it's 5 times.
Where are we starting?
I think we will start with Moscow being the capital of Russia, and if a lot of people visiting Russia may only visit Moscow, it's also the easier city to get to. There are just more flights, and you can generally find also cheaper flights to Moscow. But yeah, so we start with Moscow. I think one of the best Napoleonic museums in Europe is going to be the 1812 museum in Moscow, not on Red Square, but just off Red Square. It's housed in the building which used to be the Moscow City Duma, and only in the past few years has it been converted for its current purpose, commemorating the 200th anniversary in 2012.
And modern.
It essentially tells the story from around 1805, when obviously Russian forces are involved in the War of the Third Coalition against Napoleon and are present at the Battle of Austerlitz. In fact, most of the Allied army at the Battle of Austerlitz, and it takes you to the 1806 and 1807 campaign and the Treaty of Tilsit, and that's where things sort of start in earnest. And there's there are interesting displays about the Bonaparte family, and then it sort of brings you to the beginnings of the 1812 campaign, and Napoleon is massing his army, is crossing the river Niemen.
See previous video for information on this.
Indeed. And then so this is when you're at the ground floor, and then you climb up to the first floor, and you double back on yourself, and that's where most of the interesting content is going to be, and most of the interesting artifacts, because that's where you have the video and interactive displays on the course of the campaign, and you have portraits of the senior commanders, and some of the most interesting artifacts you will find in the collection include Marshal Davout's baton and his marshal's hat, his bicorn, which was captured by the Russians at the Battle of Krasny.
When they got the rest of his baggage train that they didn't get at Vyazma.
Yes. Also connected with Napoleon's retreat, they have the sleigh in which he used to get out of Russia, to escape. But and also another very funny object is it's a small sort of statue figurine of Alexander Osterman Tolstoy, the commander of Russian Fourth Corps in 1812, who was later in 1813 present at the Battle of Kulm, and it was his corps which was engaged against Van Damme at Kulm, and during the battle, Osman Tolstoy lost his arm. You have both the coat that he was wearing during the battle, which shows the bloodstains, and you also have a small statue or figurine of about, I guess, 15 centimeters in length and about 5 centimeters in height and width, which shows him reclining with his limb essentially placed in front of him, and which is quite weird. And obviously we know of sort of famous limbs being buried, like Stonewall Jackson's arm and Uxbridge's leg and stuff, but it's kind of weird to have like a sculpture where it's basically trying to show that, yes, this guy is missing an arm, but we promise you he once had one. That's definitely something not to be missed, and you should keep an eye out for that. The display essentially takes you right up to the Congress of Vienna and some of the diplomatic stuff. They have some caricatures of the Congress of Vienna there,
which are always worth looking at.
And then you get back down onto the ground floor, and that's where they have the collection of Vasily Vereshchagin's paintings. So it's a very interesting museum to visit. It's probably one of my favorite places to go in Moscow. I've been there on 4 separate occasions or something like that. What I would say is that it's fairly easy to get to from the metro. You would get off at the station called Ochotny Ryad, or Hunter's Row, and which is now a shopping center, very close to Red Square and the Kremlin, and it's no more than a 5-minute walk from there, which actually leads us on quite nicely to the Alexander Gardens, which is even closer to Ochotny Ryad. And in the Alexander Gardens, if you come in from the station, what you would also see is through the gates is the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier and the Eternal Flame, which obviously commemorates the Second World War, Great Patriotic War as it's known in Russia. But if you go further along, eventually you will reach the statue of Alexander I. And again, this is a fairly recent addition to Moscow. It was only erected in 2014, the bicentennial of Alexander's and the Russian army's arrival in Paris in 1814. And what you get is an imposing statue of the Tsar himself, and on the plinth on one side is a scene showing Alexander at the Battle of Leipzig, and on the other showing the triumphal entry into Paris. As with quite a lot of Russian statues in Moscow, there's also a second part of the statue which is across the footpath, and that's where you have some other scenes, including the gathering of Russian generals, senior Russian generals of the war. And I particularly like the representation because it's basically got sort of like 2 flanks of generals, and Barclay and Kutuzov are at the head of each of these columns, and they're sort of looking at each other, sort of staring down each other in a rather in the way that these things used to happen in 1812. So it sounds
very impressive. It sounds like something you would want to see.
And just to actually mention why it's called Alexander Gardens, it's because after Moscow was destroyed largely by fire in 1812, and also the Kremlin was left in a significant state of disrepair by Napoleon, there used to be a river which ran in front of the Kremlin wall, a small river. I mean, there is still a river called the Moskva River, which runs along the other side of the Kremlin. But along this part of the wall, there used to be a river called the Nelignaia. And it, as a result of the devastation to Moscow in 1812, essentially, like, the river was like full of rubbish and stuff, and they just decided to fill it up and transform it into a garden, which they called after the reigning czar at the time, Alexander. So that's why it's called Alexander Gardens, and that's why in 2014 they decided to put a monument to Tsar Alexander in the Alexander Gardens. So we move on to the Cathedral of Christ the Saviour, which, yeah, it's about 20-25 minutes walk from the Alexander Gardens, because you have to like double back on yourself, because that's how Moscow works. And if you want to get there by metro, the closest station is Kropotkinskaya, named after the Russian anarchist Pyotr Kropotkin.
Of course.
And so the Cathedral of Christ the Saviour is one of the largest Orthodox cathedrals in the world, and indeed Christian cathedrals in the world. And it has an interesting history, because Tsar Alexander I, like as early as the end of 1812, basically signed a decree saying that there should be a cathedral built in the memory of the war. And initially it was going to be in on the Sparrow Hills, which is where Moscow State University is now. But they dug the foundations, found the ground not very suitable. So instead they ended up moving it on the banks of the river Moskva, about 15 minutes from the Kremlin as the crow flies. But it's an absolutely monumental cathedral, and building work really began in earnest in around the 1830s, so after Alexander's death. It was initially meant to be built in a sort of more Byzantine style, but then it was decided to turn it into a more sort of neoclassical building. It took about 40 years to build. In order to celebrate the opening of the cathedral, a guy named Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky was asked to compose some ceremonial music. And
can you guess which one it was?
What he composed was the famous 1812 overture. The premiere of the overture was given when the cathedral was not quite yet complete, but it was already open. And I think there was still scaffolding in the background. But in any case, they waited long enough for this church to be built. Inside, it commemorates 1812, and indeed the following campaigns through sort of marble plaques on the walls, which give you details of various engagements and lists of officers who were killed or wounded. So it's a very very solemn place when you walk around, and especially if you're interested in the Napoleonic Wars and you're interested in 1812, and you sort of scan the walls for the names of people like Bagration and Tuchkov and so on, who lost their lives in 1812 and the further campaigns.
And is there, just curious about visiting Russian churches, do you have to be aware of anything?
So what you have to be aware of is essentially, don't turn up in shorts. Like, make sure you at least your knees are covered. This applies to all genders, and if it comes to headwear, essentially men have to take any headwear off, and women have to cover their heads. So if you're a man and you're visiting in winter and you're wearing a furry Russian hat, then you have to take it off. And if you're a woman and you're visiting in summer and you're not wearing a furry Russian hat, you have to find something to wear.
You have to find a furry Russian hat.
I don't think, I think a sort of headscarf is, and in most Russian churches they will provide a headscarf for women who don't have one, as well as anything to sort of wrap around the knees if needed.
Policy on a lot of people will take their phones to these places and cameras.
Yes, I would say in most cases avoid taking photos inside Russian churches. Unless they have specifically been turned into museums, so like the Kremlin churches, that is at least more socially acceptable.
Okay.
But yeah, at least if you're trying to take pictures in Russian churches, just try not to let anyone see you.
Okay. Make sure you use the phone about here, as if you have something to text. Right.
Otherwise, you may indeed have an angry babushka shouting at you. Another interesting thing about the Cathedral of Christ the Saviour is it has a rather ridiculous history, because after taking like 40 years to build, in 1935, I believe, during the Soviet era, when a guy named Joe Stalin was around, he decided to essentially demolish the church. And he did so overnight because he thought people would notice if he did it during the day. And, needless to say...
My response to that is wordless. I'm just going to put my head on each shoulder.
I mean, needless to say, firstly, this is a massive church, so it's part of the Moscow skyline, especially back then, because, you didn't have particularly tall buildings. So people are going to realize when it's missing. And also, it's a massive church, so it essentially took 2 days for the dust to settle once it was destroyed. But destroyed it was, and the grand plan was for Stalin was to build the Palace of the Soviets on the site, and this was going to be a massive palace, and it was supposed to hold it was supposed to be a venue for the Congress of the Soviets, and it would have a massive statue of Lenin pointing at the top of it, absolutely massive. Unfortunately, a little known event called World War II intervened, and the Soviet budget kind of had other priorities, and the building of this massive palace never materialized. But the foundations were dug, but essentially they just ran out of money. And when Khrushchev came around in the early, or rather in the mid 1950s, he basically said, right, we're not going ahead with this. And they decided, in their Soviet wisdom, to turn it into the largest open-air swimming pool in the world. Which, it was actually a rather popular attraction for the Muscovite population to go, and it sort of fitted into this Soviet message of having exercise as part of a community.
My expression throughout that entire story, which is it so far, is just telling its own story. Really, it's just.
Yeah, I feel like they should just look at your half of the screen. But how am I suggesting you visit it now? Well, because in the 1980s, as we all know, the Soviet Union was on its last legs, and there's a guy called Mikhail Gorbachev who had these radical ideas, like maybe we shouldn't suppress any sort of negative opinions against the government and against the party. And maybe we should also go back into Russian history and rehabilitate some of the the more righteous figures, or the figures from Imperial Russian history, let's say. So as part of this movement, there was a plan to essentially rebuild the Cathedral of Christ the Saviour. And this was largely financed by donations to the Orthodox Church, as well as by rich businessmen who got rich during the early 1990s. And building work began in 1995 under the supervision of the Georgian architect Zurab Tsereteli, and it took 5 years for building to complete. So a lot quicker than the initial building, but that's because they did take some shortcuts with materials and stuff. But the building now does look very much like what it used to before it was demolished. And what I would say is that when you do go inside and you sort of see the icons and you see the wall paintings and stuff, you do get the feeling that it's quite new. It hasn't really been sort of worn down by the ravages of time. So it's to some extent it's a less authentic experience, but I don't think that really applies when it comes to the marble plaques and stuff commemorating 1812 and the other campaign.
That story itself will attract a lot of people wanting to see it, I think.
Yeah. And there is the option to actually take a lift to sort of go up on a viewing terrace. I would say there are better places in Moscow if you want a panorama. I mean, it's not bad, but you're not actually that high. If someone likes doing that, then that's an option. So the next religious building is the Novodevichy Convent, and this is a very beautiful building. It's one of the most beautiful buildings in Moscow, so long as it's not under scaffolding, which it has been for some while now. When I visited in 2015, there was actually an exhibition about Moscow during the Napoleonic occupation, and also some stuff about the partisan war that happened around it. What there is now, which you should be able to see despite the scaffolding, is the grave of Denis Davidov within the monastery, within the convent walls. So Denis Davidov is obviously the famous partisan fighter, and for fans of World War I, actually the great Russian general from World War I, Alexei Brusilov, is also buried within the grounds of the convent. So we move on from the Novodevichy convent, which will hopefully open in greater sort of, you can see some parts of it, but more of it will hopefully open over the coming years. And we move on to this area of Moscow called Park Pobyedy, which literally translates to Victory Park. And that's got a lot of 1812 stuff in it. It's also got a lot of Second World War stuff in it. So it will. So those of you who are interested in the Second World War, I'll also mention a few things there. So Park Pobyedy metro station itself is actually very interesting. On the dark blue line, line number 3, the station there. Once you get out, but once you sort of get into the central concourse, you will be able to see at one end a mosaic which shows the Russian generals of 1812, including Kutuzov, Barclay, Bagration, Platov, Yermolov, Doktorov, Raevsky, and a couple of others, I believe. And that is, very, very much worth having a quick look at and taking a photo before you head out. And once you do head out, you have a decision to make. You can either head up a hill and towards a massive, great pointy monument, which is which is the Second World War monument. But for the 1812 stuff, you'll be going in the other direction, and what you'll be seeing in the other direction is a massive triumphal arch. The triumphal arch in Moscow was first built in the 1830s or so, and its initial location was sort of in the northwest of the city on the road from St. Petersburg. So yeah, I guess people could see it because that was usually the way people went to Moscow. But in the Soviet period, it was dismantled and placed in an archaeological museum. And it was only in the 1960s when they decided to rebuild it at its current location, which is on Kutuzovsky Prospect, otherwise known as Kutuzov Avenue, and that is where you would see the triumphal arch. Now it's got it's got various things you would find on a triumphal arch. The sort of trophies of war and a six-horse chariot on the top, which I believe is 2 more than the Wellington Arch.
Probably. I don't think I've counted them. I think there's only 4. It's a quadriga up on top of the Wellington Arch. So yeah.
In any case, that's just to get one over Marcus.
Yeah. He's going to say that, but he is going to come back at you and say that the original thing on top of that was a massive statue of the Duke of Wellington,
which was horrible.
Nobody liked it. No.
After that segue, we will go on to the Borodino Panorama Museum, which is just a bit further along, and that is where you will see Franz Rubol's panorama of the Battle of Borodino, painted, I believe, in 1912, or at least sort of in preparation for the centennial in 1912. And the museum has undergone some renovation recently. It's now reopened. It's a very impressive place. The whole panorama is, I cannot describe it's just describe the size. You're going to be walking around for a while. So that's the panorama itself. It's sort of, there are screens around where you're walking, so you'll be able to sort of zoom in greater detail, where you can sort of see where Napoleon is, where Barclay de Tolly is, sort of quite in the distance, and where Kutuzov is, and Bagration being carted away after being wounded. So it's quite impressive. So just in front of the panorama, you have Kutuzov's monument. It's an equestrian monument where, he's essentially sort of on a horse, and he's
being very, very general-like on top of his horse.
Being very sort of
not something he's terribly famous for, being on a horse, but
or being on a horse unassisted. But what's also very interesting is on the plinth of the monument, on essentially 3 sides. So on the left, right, and the rear, you have also representations, sculptural representations of Russian generals Russian generals, as well as sort of partisan fighters and other sort of more peasanty type figures who were more popular in the Soviet era, and therefore they have the right half of it, and the left half of it is the generals, and Bagration is at the head of them, and Barclay is behind him, slightly obscured by some of the others. It's quite interesting, the way that these guys are depicted, because this one is during the Soviet era. It has Bagration as like number 2 and Barclay as number 3, whereas, as I said, with the one erected in 2014, it has Kutuzov and Barclay being the ones in the center focus. And close to the monument, just behind the monument and behind the Borodino Panorama Museum, is Kutuzov's hut, where the Council of Fili was held. Now, this is not the original hut, which was lost, I believe, around the 1860s due to fire. But in the 1880s, it was rebuilt and turned into a small museum. Yeah.
Because there was a lot of paintings done of the hut originally, so they managed to rebuild it from paintings, I assume.
Yes. I mean, I don't think it's terribly faithful to the paintings, but you know.
Okay.
It's a wooden hut. It's around the same area because this is Fili. Fili in 1812. Fili was not actually part of Moscow.
Yeah, we talk about it in the other video where they have to get to Moscow from Fili. So
yeah. But now it is very much part of the Moscow metropolitan area. It's a district in the city now. And just the final location in Moscow is not too far. It's actually along the same avenue, but Kutuzov Avenue is very long, so you're probably better off trying to get there by metro. And it is the Bagration Monument, the equestrian monument of Bagration, again rather recent, from 1999, and I think it's actually more impressive than the Kutuzov one, at least the main equestrian figure itself, because it shows Bagration in a very dynamic pose with his sword held aloft behind him and his horse.
It's what an equestrian statue should be for a guy like Bagration. It does him justice. and that should be what, if you know anything about Bagration, then
it's quite a moving monument in a way, because you can just sort of see him, and obviously the movies do this very well. You can see him sort of preparing himself for the great charge, and suddenly he gets struck on the leg, and the wind is taken from his sails, and unfortunately they never come back. Now, unfortunately, the setting is not great. It's like you get these sort of Soviet sort of housing blocks on either side. It's not particularly fitting for such a monument. But as I saw on a Russian website, better a great monument in a terrible location than a terrible monument at a great location.
Okay. There's some logic there, I guess.
Yeah. So I think we can now move on.
Yeah, that's the list of Moscow. Yeah. Where to next?
Where to next? Well, there's
been a clue if you've been listening.
If you are in Moscow, then you may want to sort of take a day trip or two around Moscow to visit some of the battlefields. And obviously the main battlefield that you would want to visit is that of Borodino.